Good afternoon, Chief Arradondo.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
Thank you for being here this afternoon and this morning.
Thank you.
A few follow-up questions for you regarding this incident. Your determinations today are in reference to employment policies and Mr. Chauvin's actions violating the departmental employment policies.
That is correct.
Now, as the police chief, I assume that you're not out on the street day-to-day arresting people.
That is correct.
Can you just give me a general sense, when's the last time that you've actually, I don't mean to be dismissive, but actually arrested a suspect?
It's been many years, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Your role as the Minneapolis police chief is sort of grander in its scope, right? I mean,
It's large in context and the operations of the department, yes.
and part of that job is to be sort of aware of issues in policing, kind of policy changes, use of force changes. All of these things fall under the umbrella of your role as the chief. Agreed?
Yes.
And you're sort of the general in a sense, right? Formulating the plan for your police department.
And delegating some of those to our subject matter experts, yes.
Correct. When you talk about training of a police officer, you would also include the training that the Minneapolis Police Department goes through, but you may go to other trainings out of state, listen to speakers talking about issues that confront policing, right?
Yes.
As well as maybe a homicide detective will get permission to travel to an interviewing a suspect type of a training in some other state or location, right?
Yes.
And so there is a variability within the training depending upon your role as in the police department, right?
Yes.
So that you've got sort of your rank and file basic patrol officers, and they go through all of the trainings that you've described, the defensive tactics, medical assistance or basic medical training, crisis intervention, things that we've been talking about here today, right?
Yes.
And then the investigative type officers, they may go to some they have to go through that training, but they may go through some additional training in terms of how to interview suspects or how to properly collect evidence, etc., unique to their role, right?
Yes.
And then you as the police chief or those who are in the more management or administrative side of the police department, you go to the kind of the big picture training sometimes.
That's correct.
All right. So I want to review with you a few of the policies that we've already talked about today. If we can take this down for the moment, Your Honor. First of all, I'd like to show you what has been introduced as Exhibit 216, which is the use of force policy for the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
Yes.
We've discussed this. And I know that kind of what we did a little earlier is we kind of jumped around from part to part, but I'd like to walk through some of these issues in a little bit more linear fashion, if we could. So you've described under policy 5-301.01 that the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness standard applies to the use of force in Minneapolis, of the Minneapolis Police Department. Agreed?
Yes.
And that goes on to say that MPD employees shall only use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable, and it continues in light of the facts and circumstances known to that employee at the time the force is used. Correct?
Yes.
So the reasonableness standard, or the objectively reasonable standard, applies to the facts and circumstances that are known by the officer at the time the force is being used. Correct?
Yes.
Now, 5-302 gives some definitions in terms of the use of force, and it differentiates between active aggression and active resistance. Can you describe the difference between active aggression and active resistance?
Active aggression, behavior initiated by the subject that may or may not be in response to police efforts to bring the person into custody or control. The active aggression, when presenting behaviors that constitute an assault, or in the circumstances reasonably indicate that an assault or an injury to any person is likely to occur at any moment. That's for active aggression.
Yep, let me just stop you there. That's active aggression. So that's where a suspect is essentially fighting with a police officer or doing something that is aggressive, behaviorally speaking. Agreed?
Yes.
And that is aggressive in its nature.
Yes.
Now, can you read active resistance?
Active resistance is a response to police efforts to bring a person into custody or control for detainment or arrest. Subject engages in active resistance when engaging in physical actions or verbal behavior reflecting an intention to make it more difficult for officers to achieve actual physical control.
So essentially what we're talking about here is behavior that may or may not be physical in its nature that simply makes it harder for an officer to take a person into custody. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes that is maybe not trying to punch the officer, but pulling away or hiding his arms or doing something that just makes it more difficult physically, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it's, you're not going to take me alive, you dirty cop, like they're saying something to prevent the officer from arresting.
Yes.
Right? So they're using their words, they're using their behaviors. Is it common, based upon your experience, for people to enjoy being taken into custody? Do people like to be arrested?
Typically not.
Right. And in your experience, is it common practice for people whom are being arrested to say things in an effort to try to get the officer to not arrest them?
That certainly occurs, yes.
Right. My mom is homesick, I need to get home to my kids. There may be words that they use to try to convince an officer to not arrest them, right?
Yes.
Now, you would also agree that there is a difference between being arrested and being detained. Agreed?
There can be,
Right.
yes.
So an officer in certain circumstances is permitted to expand the scope of the original intervention. Would you agree with that?
Objection made.
You can restate.
Let me try. When an officer approaches a situation, and let's assume it's a relatively minor offense, is it possible that that minor offense can grow in its scope of investigation?
Yes.
And it's actually quite common for that to happen, correct?
Yes.
An officer makes a traffic stop for speeding or something like that, smells drugs in the car, searches the car, finds a large amount of drugs, finds guns, etc., right?
Yes.
So what starts out as a relatively minor incident, a traffic ticket, can turn into a felony arrest, correct?
It could.
And that, again, happens quite regularly.
Yes.
So when an officer, well, let me back up a second. You would agree that being a police officer is a pretty dangerous profession.
There are inherent dangers with it.
I've never had to get in a fight with anybody in my life, in my job, right? But in your job, it's probably more probable that that will happen. Would you
Yes.
agree with that? Now, talking about the use of force, when an officer approaches a motor vehicle, is that considered to be one of the most dangerous initiations of contact between an officer and a citizen?
I don't have the exact statistics on it. It's certainly an encounter that officers are certainly more heightened. I know that domestic response calls can also have a sense of heightened awareness for officers, but it's certainly something, a traffic stop certainly raises an awareness for officers, yes, for their safety.
And that's because that's that suspect's sort of space, right? The officer doesn't know what's in the car or in the apartment during a domestic situation. You're walking into someone else's territory, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Right. And so there could be guns, there could be knives, there could be any number of instruments that could bring harm to a police officer, right?
There's that potential.
Now, obviously, there's tens of thousands of traffic stops, and there's not every traffic stop turns violent. I'm not suggesting that, but that does happen regularly. Agreed? That traffic stops turn violent.
Yes, they can.
So when we're talking about the use of force policy under 5-301.01, the last sentence that wasn't read before is the force used shall be consistent with current MPD training. Agreed?
Yes.
Now there's a difference between a policy change and like a best practice change. Would you agree with that?
Can you clarify?
Sure. So there are certain times where the policy, it's with respect to the use of force, may specifically change to prohibit a particular style or use of force, right?
Yes.
So thinking about in the old days, officers used to wear like weighted gloves to make their punches more effective, right?
Yes.
The policy changed and prohibited that, correct?
Yes.
And then there's a difference between, say, the evolution of defensive tactics. Would you agree with that? I mean, the defensive tactics training you received in 1989 is much different than the defensive tactics training that's taught now, right?
Yes.
And I believe it was maybe 15 years ago that the Minneapolis Police Department started moving towards more body weight control, sort of this jujitsu training, as opposed to physically striking people to gain compliance.
And are you referencing policy or training?
Training,
I believe so.
about 10, 15 years ago, agreed?
Yes.
And that was sort of highlighting the evolution, as you kind of described it in your direct examination, of policing since you've become a police officer. That's
Yes.
one way it's evolved.
Yes.
And when something changes per policy, can't wear weighted gloves anymore, for example, that's it, no more. Agreed?
Yes. Agreed. Yes.
But if the policy, if training, for example, evolves into a best practice, it doesn't prevent an officer from learning a technique he learned earlier in his career. It just may not be the best practice anymore.
So I pause just to, when you say that they're learning something, but if it's not in alignment with our policy, then that would not be prohibited. If I'm hearing you correctly.
Let me try to explain. So if an officer was trained in a particular handcuffing technique, and then they go to their defensive tactics training and they say, this is a better way to handcuff a suspect, it's not a policy change, it's just a best practice change. And they can still use the old way they did it.
It would, Counselor, it would have to be something that the training staff would have to, not just an officer saying, I want to do it this way. And I mean, it's something that would have to be authorized through our training staff. Yes.
So we could talk about that kind of thing with the training, the use of force defensive tactics training, right? That would be the better place to talk, better people to talk to about that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, when we're talking about active aggression and active resistance, sometimes those two things are happening simultaneously. Agreed?
It can be, yes.
Go back to... So now we were talking then about, again, the Graham versus Connor case. and how that is incorporated into the Minneapolis Police Department policy. And I'm showing you Exhibit 217 now. It should be up in front of you. What we're basically talking about was a United States Supreme Court decision that outlined the objectively reasonable use of force standard, right?
Yes.
And Graham versus Connor is not limited to those three factors that you were read before, right? The Graham versus Connor analysis.
Yes, correct.
Those are three that are kind of listed, but ultimately it's not an all-inclusive list of considerations for the reasonableness of the use of force. Agreed?
That would be my understanding, yes.
And in fact, what the policy reads is that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable officer on the scene rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight, right?
Yes.
So we're looking at it in the instant and the moment based upon the objective standard, right?
Yes.
Now the policy also includes that the calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation, right?
Yes.
And that's because when officers go to a situation, kind of like what we talked about before, what can be initially very minor can grow into something major. Agreed?
Yes.
Now to show you Exhibit 219. You read a part of 5-304, which is threatening the use of force and de-escalation. And I want to talk to you a little bit about de-escalation. Have you heard the term, sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate? You ever heard that phrase?
I have not heard that.
Okay. So in here you talk about, or the policy talks about, that officers shall consider verbally announcing their intent to use force, including displaying an authorized weapon as a threat of force, right? So sometimes an officer has to take out his gun, say, hey, I mean, that's a use of force in that instance, right?
Yes.
And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to use force. It's a pretty clear indication that force could be used when you have a gun pointing at you. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
But other things such as chemical irritants or tasers, it's not limited to just the firearm, right?
Yes.
And so sometimes what an officer has to do is command the presence, right? They have to take control of the situation.
Yes.
And sometimes that's not particularly attractive, is it?
Could you explain?
Sure. The use of force is not something that people like to watch generally, right?
Objection, speculation, and argument.
Sustained.
Would you agree that the use of force is not an attractive notion?
I would say that use of force is something that most officers would rather not use. Yes.
Right. And you described in your direct examination how the single greatest way that the Minneapolis Police Department could be judged is based upon how the public perceives its use of force.
Yes.
Right? So it has a tendency to garner a lot of attention.
It can.
So much so that citizens have become more prone to record observed interactions with police, right?
Yes.
Something that you didn't have to deal with back in 1989, right?
Yes.
So essentially what this policy 5-304 in terms of threatening the use of force, it's contained within this de-escalation concept, right? So sometimes you have to display a weapon to gain command so that you can de-escalate, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about, is it fair to say that pretty much every single one of these use of force of policies contains some phrase, if reasonable or if practical? There's limitations on the use of force, right?
Yes, there are limitations, yes.
And it's situation by situation, right?
Yes.
And then again, if we go back and look at the language of the Graham versus Connor and the policy that's contained by Minneapolis Police Department, it's the use of force has no precise, objective, singular rule. It's different in every case.
Yes.
So for example, in the de-escalation policy 5-304B1, de-escalation is advisable when it is safe and feasible, correct?
Yes.
And sometimes de-escalation, again, includes the use of force, right? The use of force can be a de-escalation tactic.
I was thinking of your example of displaying your weapon, and so I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of physical force being used to actually de-escalate a situation, but the threatening use of force or threatening verbally, I'm more familiar with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, if we were to talk to the use of force or defensive tactics,
Objection, argumentative,
Overruled.
they would be the best source of that.
objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes.
But the purpose of de-escalation, agreed, is to attempt to slow down or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources become available to the officer.
Yes.
Basically, slow down, everybody kind of calm down, let's try to relax, right?
Yes.
But it's a lot more. The process of de-escalation is not just trying to talk somebody out of doing something. There are actions that are important. There may be reactions that are important, and the de-escalation policy includes some examples of those things, right?
Yes.
Such as placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer.
Yes.
Sometimes those barriers are another officer, right?
Yes.
Containing a threat, right? I mean, that's one of the examples in policy.
Yes.
By containing a threat, that can include physically restraining someone so that they don't upset another person, right?
Yes.
Or cause another person to have a violent reaction towards them or officers, right?
Yes.
Moving from a position that exposes officers to potential threats to a safer position, right? So kind of retreating in certain circumstances.
Yes.
Reducing exposure to a potential threat using distance, cover, or concealment, right? So hiding, say, behind a squad car, right?
Yes.
Avoiding physical confrontation. That's probably a pretty big one, right?
Yes.
And using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject or promote rational decision-making. That's kind of down towards the end.
Yes.
And lastly, calling additional resources. Right?
Yes.
And we talked about Exhibit 230. Showing you Exhibit 230, which is the emergency medical response. You'd agree that the policy requires Minneapolis police employees to request an emergency medical service as soon as practical, right?
Yes.
if a person comes into contact having an acute medical crisis, and any delay in treatment could potentially aggravate the severity of the medical crisis, right?
Yes.
So sometimes officers will call for EMS, not thinking it's a major issue. When suddenly it becomes apparent, they can step up or request a quicker response from EMS, right?
Yes.
And that is something that an officer can do to ensure the medical treatment of the suspect that they have, or the person that they're in contact with, right?
Counselor, to ensure,
Sorry, it's been a long week. To ensure the medical condition of the suspect, to help with that.
yes,
Right. Get EMS there as quickly as is possible. Right?
yes.
Now, we didn't talk about the maximal restraint technique. You're familiar with the policy surrounding that?
Yes.
I'm going to show to you what's been admitted as Exhibit 225. Can you describe what the maximal restraint technique is?
Yes, Counselor, the maximal restraint technique has often been referred to as the hobble. And that is it's a method of, if officers are dealing with typically a combative or aggressive person, in order to protect them or even property, it's placing, basically attaching a cord of the legs to the waist, so that the individual, does not have free movement of their legs. So it's securing them, again, usually by their ankles. If you're prone, bringing that up to your waist and securing it. The maximal restraint technique, or the hobble, though, if it's used, a supervisor has to respond to the scene. You cannot transport anyone prone in that position due to the risks of the breathing. But that is Counselor, that would be my understanding of the MRT, or the maximal restraint technique.
So you talked a little bit in terms of the use of force, how officers are kind of reevaluating their use of force from time to time, right? They
Yes.
should be, at least, right? And so if officers decide to use the maximal restraint technique, and then decide, hey, we know, and then later decide not to use it, right? That is kind of adjusting that use of force.
I would, Counselor, with some clarity, I don't know if what I mean by that is, if you were to have a person handcuffed and prone on their stomach on the ground and pavement, and you had two officers, let's say, securing their legs to the back of the waist, you in a way are still employing what that technique is about anyway. So there can be some variances to that.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does. So let's assume that you've got two officers pulling the legs forward, essentially employing that aversion, so to speak, of the maximal restraint. But then they release and they say, we're not gonna hobble this person. We're not gonna employ the MRT. You're going from a decision to employ that technique backwards down the continuum in terms of the use of force. Would you agree with that?
And Counselor, I just because these types of uses of force can be problematic in terms of there's a high risk to them. So meaning that if you're going to take that initiative to do that alternative version in the first place, you'd want to get a hold of a supervisor, because something could happen in terms of that person. And so
I'm not
yeah.
I'm not asking in terms of the policy. I'm asking in terms of sort of the use of force and the critical decision-making model, right? You described how the use of force, you have to go through this critical decision-making model. How much force am I going to use? And sometimes you have to back off the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to go forward with the use of force, meaning you use even more force,
Yes.
right? And it's this constant reevaluation. Agreed?
Yes.
And so when you have officers who make a decision that the facts and circumstances would warrant using the hobble device, but then later decide not to employ that device, that is that critical decision-making model in action. Agreed?
Yes.
And it would be a reduction in the use of force. It may still require supervisors to be on scene, policy-wise, but it is a reduction in the use of force. Agreed?
And Counselor, are we talking specifically the events of May 25th?
I'm talking generally.
In general, yes.
But you would agree, ultimately, that all of the Minneapolis Police Department policies relevant to the use of force, emergency medical response, emergency medical treatment, all of these policies are, by their very language, are situationally dependent, right? They all say, if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe. They have a qualifier to them. Agreed?
Yes, I would agree with that.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 231. Which is at the bottom of Exhibit 231 is the crisis intervention policy. And the second page includes the definition. Could you read the entire definition of what a crisis is?
Yes. An event or situation where an individual's safety and health are threatened by behavioral health challenges to include mental illness, developmental disabilities, substance use, or overwhelming stressors. A crisis can involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the individual's current resources and coping mechanisms and may include unusual stress in his or her life that renders him or her unable to function as he or she normally would. The crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to himself, herself, and or others.
All right. So generally speaking, again, not relevant to the May 25th of 2020 incident. We'll get there in a minute. But when we talk about a general police response, sometimes the police may respond to something and the person they're dealing with is not in a crisis. Agreed?
Yes.
But other people may be perceiving what is happening and it could become a crisis to that person.
Objection.
If you could rephrase.
Sure. People who observe, would you say that people who observe police interactions with people, especially the more physical or use of force types, that could turn into a crisis for an observer?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained is calling for speculation.
So in terms of the definition of crisis, a crisis may involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds that individual's current resources and coping mechanisms, right?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person with whom you are arresting or having contact with is going to be the person who will experience the crisis. Agreed?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
And Counselor, just respectfully, so you're saying that the person who's witnessing a situation with the officers, that situation may cause them to be in crisis?
Correct.
Could potentially.
Right. And the crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to him, her, or others. Right?
And Counselor, just this is the person who's watching this.
Right.
It could.
So people are watching what something that they appear to believe or they believe is wrong or contrary to police policy that may cause them to get upset, and that level of upset or that level of volatility may grow throughout the course of the interaction.
Objection irrelevant, calls for speculation and beyond the scope.
Overruled. It's within the scope.
It could.
Because ultimately, part of the training that Minneapolis police officers have to go through is how to deal with crowds who observe police interactions, right?
Yes.
Crowds that may be upset with police interaction, right?
Yes.
I mean, there are classes through the training academy, there are classes through in-service specifically dealing with how to deal with crowd control, right?
Yes.
And all of this is to revert in part back to that de-escalation process as well, right?
Yes.
So part of it, as a crowd grows or becomes more upset, part of it is to try to de-escalate, which can involve trying to avoid a physical confrontation, right?
Yes, it could. Yes.
Trying to stay safe, concealed, and covered, right?
Yes.
Not yelling back at somebody, not engaging with them verbally, right?
Yes.
And sometimes when an officer tries to de-escalate a situation and someone is so upset, right? Sometimes they don't hear what the officer tells them. Would you agree with that?
Objection, speculation.
That calls for speculation. It is sustained.
Is it possible, generally speaking, that someone's own crisis may prevent them from hearing what an officer is telling them?
That could happen.
Hold on. The objection is sustained. The answer will be stricken.
So you testified that you've watched the body cameras, correct?
Yes.
Going to show you, I don't know. Mr. Slisher, this is exhibit 1008, which is a 10-second, approximately 5-second clip of Alexander King's body-worn camera. It's already in, and I gave you a copy of it.
Is this in evidence?
Not yet, no. I'm just telling you, first and foremost, that's what it is. I'm going to show you on your screen a short clip of a video to see if this would be contained in what you've watched. And I need to... You would agree that that appears to be taken from one of the officer's body cameras, May 25th, 2020, at approximately 20, 25, and 33 seconds.
Yes.
In, again, watching it without sound. Do you, at this point, did you see what appeared to be a reflection in the back of the squad car there?
Counselor, I did not.
Okay.
And it might just be because of the brevity of the video, but
Yeah, it's unfortunate. If you look in the upper left-hand corner at the bumper of the squad video.
Use the cursor to circle it for him.
I'm sorry?
Use the cursor, the stylus to...
Oh, sure. That's right. Forgot all this fancy technology here. You see the legs of someone in reflecting?
yes.
And so you would agree that this appears to be a short clip from one of the officer's body-worn cameras on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
You've seen these before. You see what appears to be Mr. Floyd's arm there by the back of the squad car, right?
Yes.
So I would offer Exhibit 1008.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
1008 is received.
And if I may publish.
Come over here.
Up on the sidewalk.
Yeah, we need you to keep some distance.
Sorry, didn't mean to replay. Do you hear our voice say we've got an ambulance coming?
Yes.
Oops, sorry, if we could take that down. Now, policy 5-311. Let's talk a little bit about 5-311, which is the neck restraint policy. Get rid of this.
Council, will you stay there
For a second?
Sure.
Welcome everyone here to News Now from Fox. We are listening to extensive cross-examination here of the Minneapolis police chief. At the center of today, they are talking about, okay, what is proper use of force? And we are getting all the details here. Oh, looks like we're going to have something.
Mid-afternoon break. We'll reconvene around 3:20. Thank you.
All right, so about a 20-minute break right there. We just heard